Gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Executive Director Amanda Littleton.
Good evening, and welcome to the 12th annual Stories About This Place. Tonight is an opportunity to celebrate our community's shared love of the land and the good fortune we all have to live here in the Monadnock region and call it our home. I'm Amanda Littleton, the director of the Monadnock Conservancy, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our team of staff, I would like to thank you for coming out tonight. We invite you to enjoy the storytelling, to take a collective, deep breath and engage in this moment of being grounded in community and place. We gather to hear stories about connections to the land, stories that help us recognize something essential, that the land shapes us just as we shape it. Through work or wander, through stewardship or through stillness, we form bonds that are both deeply personal and collectively shared. The Monadnock Conservancy has a mission to protect land, to steward natural resources, and foster strong community connections to this place. This year, the Conservancy's story continues to unfold. The story of our 37th year has been one of transition, one of growth and progress. It has been marked by a groundswell of support from our community. It's led to the successful completion of our capital campaign, where over $7 million were raised in support of our mission. It's your generosity that has led to the construction of our new headquarters that you see pictured here. This is a net zero building that meets the highest standards for sustainability, embodies the values of the Conservancy. And with this new home comes the commitment to further our community engagement efforts, creating a hub for conservation in the heart of Keene that will serve our entire 39-town region. We are so excited about the whole host of new programming that we're going to be able to share with you in this space on Ashwalet Street and out on the land in this coming year. We're going to be moving in this summer, and we're so eager to open our doors and welcome you into this new home. We're going to have our open house and annual celebration on Saturday, October 3rd. It's a pretty early save the date, so mark your calendars. But beyond the building, it's your community support that has really afforded us the opportunity to add 4 new staff members to our growing team. Could all our team members just stand up and give us a little bit of a wave for a minute so folks can see who you are? It's an amazing group of people, and we hope that you all get an opportunity to say hello to them tonight and to get them to know them even more in this coming year. So it is with your support that this expanded capacity that we are accelerating the pace of conservation and land protection efforts in our region. With double our staff and land protection, we're going to be strategically adding to the 24,000 acres that are already protected and cared for by our stewardship team. So as you can see, the Conservancy is really in a strong position, poised to take even greater conservation action. And all of that is thanks to you, a community who cares deeply about conservation. And we want to celebrate your generosity because it is your commitment and passion shaping the story of the Monadnock region. At this event last year, one of our speakers, Chick Colony of Harrisville, he stood in this very spot and he said, "Looking back 100 years from now, I hope our children will say that we put in the hard work. We had the foresight and the generosity to conserve this region. Well, I share this hope, and I know many of you in this audience do as well. And during my first year as director, I have just found a well of inspiration and a deep commitment in our supporters, and I am wholly convinced that we collectively do have the determination and the generosity to fulfill this promise to future generations. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being collaborators on writing this story of conservation for our community and for our land. And speaking of collaborations, tonight we've added a special twist to the event with a silent auction of hearts that have been painted by local artists and our friends in conservation. So during intermission, we invite you to check them out, make a bid on these miniature masterpieces. And now, for the reason we have all gathered here together, it's time for us to take in the stories, to let them open our hearts and our minds to the full spectrum of relationships that can be formed with this place, and acknowledge that living, shifting exchange of care and responsibility between people and the land. So it is my honor to introduce you to our first speaker, our first of four for this evening. Please join me in providing a warm welcome to our friend Kim Peavey of Westmoreland, New Hampshire, and Hillside Springs Farm.
Good evening. I am glad to be here tonight. It's been a long time coming. I think I've been invited to this event for 6 or 8 years, and the stars have aligned, and I'm here tonight. Especially glad to be here with Amanda, who we've worked with many, many years in the Conservation District. She's one of our favorite people. And we've also been working on conserving our farm for a long time. We've had many of the staff come out and walk our fields and say, oh, this is a great project. We love your farm. We really want to help you put an easement on it. We have so many projects going on right now. Are you in a hurry? I say, no, we're not in a hurry. And then a few years ago, Pete Troop from the Conservancy called up and said, well, you know, the political climate is going to be changing pretty drastically and dramatically. Now we're in a hurry. So we've started the conservation process. We were kind of hoping that Pete wouldn't retire till he got us through, but I think he's going to leave us in good hands, even if he does retire before we're through the easement process. I'm here tonight with my fellow farmer and farmer fellow that you may have read about in the Monadnock Shopper News. I've been writing a sustainable farming column there for probably 12 or 15 years by now. And I'm also here with my daughter, our daughter, who has done many, many hours weeding and working on the farm and still comes back to help us, even as an adult. I'm very happy to have them both here. I have to admit that we've had kind of a hard row to hoe the last 3 years. In 2003, my spouse, my fellow farmer's mom died. A few months later, my dad died. In 2024, my mother died, and in 2025, 3 out of our 6 of our draft horses died. So they were all retired draft horses, but we thought that they were going to be with us for some time yet. So maybe 6 weeks ago, I said to my fella, I've got a great idea for my theme for the talk at the Monadnock Conservancy. Guess what it is? I love a good theme. And I said, guess what it is? And he said, I can't imagine. And I said, death and dying. And he said, you're kidding, right? I said, no, I'm not kidding. But it's going to be pretty cheerful, death and dying. Nobody's going to leave in tears or anything. And I will say that I am both a farmer and a writer. So tonight, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from a middle grade novel. I'm going to read you one of my farming columns, and I'm going to read a few poems. But if you don't like any of these options, if you thought, well, I did not sign up for death and dying, I did not sign up for a middle grade novel, and I certainly didn't sign up for poetry, you can look at my slides instead. We do have about a 55-acre farm. We have 50 CSA members. We come to the Keene Farmers Market. We farm with horses. You'll see lots of pictures of horses. And you'll see lots of pictures of vegetables. And it sometimes feels like my whole life is about vegetables. Start with sowing. We've got our greenhouse going right now. We're watering. We're transplanting. We're potting up. We're weeding and weeding and weeding. And then we get to harvest time, and then it starts coming in the kitchen, and we're doing a lot of cooking, and we're doing a lot of food preservation. We're drying, and we're canning, and we're freezing. And the funny thing is, in my entire talk, I never mention a vegetable. But you'll get to see lots of them on the screen. So my first piece here is going to be from this younger middle grade novel, let's say for 7 to 10 years old, and this is about a 10-year-old girl named Thistle. It's set in 1901 in a Welsh immigrant farming community in the foothills of the Adirondacks, which is where I grew up. So this story kind of inhabits a space between my growing up dairy farm and my adult vegetable farm. And this little girl named Thistle is very naughty. She has a pony named Tug that she loves, but it's not really her pony. It's technically the neighbor's pony. And at some point, the neighbors have a visiting grandson who starts riding her pony. She is not happy. She steals the pony. She takes the pony, she hides it on her own farm in an abandoned orchard. And this is where we're going to come in on the story. It was late. Thistle had to leave Tug alone again. Tug planted his feet firmly and wouldn't move towards the tying up tree. "Come on, Tug," Thistle pulled at him. He stood firm, stretching his neck out as long as it would go, but not moving a foot. "You have to, Tug," Thistle ordered. She tried pulling his head and neck to one side to get him a little off balance so he would start off. He just shifted one foot and stayed. "Tug," Thistle said. It was getting later and later. "Please, Tug." Tug only pulled hard at the lead rope and put his head back down to the grass. Thistle dropped the lead rope and ran to break a little switch off a tree. She had never used a switch on him, but Tug knew immediately what it was. He looked warily at her. When she reached for the lead rope, he took 3 quick steps away. "Now, Tug," Thistle put her hands on her hips. She made a little dash for the lead rope. Tug made a bigger dash away. He galloped right back down to the old orchard. The more Thistle chased him, the more fun he seemed to think it was to stay just out of reach. As the sun slipped down to the edge of the sky, Thistle began to feel desperate. She couldn't even get near Tug now. Surely the cows were already in the barn, and Papa would be missing her for milking. She was going to be in big trouble, and she would never catch Tug. Suddenly, Thistle threw down the switch and turned and ran to the barn. She'd just come back even earlier in the morning. Tug would graze happily all night. Or maybe he would step on the lead rope, still attached to the halter, and be stuck in one place. It would serve him right. It was the middle of the night. Thistle sat bolt upright in bed. She had woken up to a horrible thought. Tug still had his halter on. She wasn't ever to leave a halter on a loose horse, because the halter could get caught on something and the horse could get hurt. Thistle flung off her covers and stopped her feet from banging into the floor just in time. She must be quiet. She crept out of her room and out of the house into another bright, moonlit night. Then she ran. It was worse than the halter. Tug was deep in the orchard with all the green apples. By the time Thistle got there, the pony was rolling and thrashing in the grass. Thistle cried out and ran to him. It was colic, and colic could surely kill a horse as big as Ned or Nell, the workhorses. It could also kill a small, goldy brown, plump pony. Thistle knew she had to get Tug on his feet so he wouldn't twist up his insides. She pulled and jerked with every bit of her strength on the halter and lead rope. Tug only tossed his head and flicked his ears like she was a fly. He rolled and groaned. He was soaked with sweat. Great globs of foam came from his mouth. Tug, Tug, Thistle cried at him, pushing at his belly, slapping him, pleading. He just rolled the whites of his eyes at her. Thistle wrenched a switch from a tree. Tug did not even look at her. Thistle took the switch and stung her pony Tug over and over with it. He rolled, groaned, twitched. Please, please, Tug, Thistle cried, tears running down her face now. At last, the switch was too much. Tug heaved to his feet. Thistle pulled on him to make him walk. She hauled him around the orchard, whipping him again on the belly, his tender, good belly, when he tried to buckle his knees and go to the ground. The switch raised little welts. Thistle stumbled too, fell, gouging her knee on a rock. Blood trickled down her bare leg. Her hands burned. But she must keep Tug moving on, or he could die. She forced herself on, walking and walking, hauling and hauling Tug, talking and singing to him until she was hoarse. Hours of it, the moon shining and then hiding its face behind clouds, shining and then hiding again. Great waves of weariness washed over Thistle. Then she went beyond tiredness to numbness, not feeling the ache in her knee now, in all her legs and her arms. She was so tired she hardly realized that Tug had begun gradually to come easier with her, kicking less, groaning less. A single bird called out of the darkness. Thistle stopped, confused by the sound. Morning would come. She looked at Tug, and he was peaceful again, if also weary and sweat-stained. Still, Thistle kept walking him. Finally, he made manure, a good sign. Another bird called, another. There was the slightest lightening of the sky. At last, Tug tried to put his nose down to the grass again, to eat, and Thistle knew he was all right. So that wasn't too bad, right? That was pretty cheerful. My second piece is going to be one of my farming columns. And you may know, I hope you did know, George Islin of Marlborough Earth Haven Farm, George and Mary Islin and their 3 sons, they conserved their property with the Monadnock Conservancy in the late 2000s, I think it was. And the first place that Frank and I looked at in New Hampshire was the farm right near George and Mary's place. So we met George, we met his draft horses. We didn't end up buying that place, but George knew that we wanted to bring our draft horses from central New York State to New Hampshire, and he said, well, do you have a horse trailer? And we said, no. And he said, well, you can borrow mine. He had just met us, an hour before. And then he said, do you have a truck to pull it with? And we said, no. And he said, you can borrow my truck and my trailer. So that's how we first met George. And this story is going to be partly about George and partly about one of George's sons, Jake, who is our farrier now. He trims our horses' feet. We farmers were stumped. With 3 out of 4 draft horses unable to work due to injury and our first decent stretch of haying weather coming up, we needed to borrow a draft horse in a hurry. But how likely was that? Maybe we could call the Borrow a Draft Horse Agency, I suggested. Let's think, answered my fellow farmer. Who could we even ask? X's team is pretty old, and he won't want to split them up anyway. Y's horse might like the company of our horses, but Y would miss her horse too much. Let's try Z. And A and B and C, I added. So we made phone calls and sent emails, thinking our chances were pretty slim. How many people have draft horses anyway, and who in their right mind would ever loan one? Luckily, our farrier, Jake, son of George and Mary, whose generosity far outweighs his right-mindedness, said, sure, you can borrow Button. She could use the work. We could hardly believe it. We not only borrowed the horse, but the horse trailer to haul her. It was the same trailer. Button, who is half Belgian and half American cream, is a big horse, a beautiful pale gold color. She was also out of shape, a cream puff, said our farrier's mother, Mary. In fact, the Button was so round and gold, we were tempted to call her Butterball instead of Button. Button was not pleased to be separated from her 2 pasture mates. Happily, Mary helped us, leading Button into the trailer multiple times. Button backed right off the trailer multiple times. Mary sighed, led Button's mother into the trailer, tied her, led Button in, tied Button, then untied and backed Button's mother out off the trailer, leaving Button alone in the trailer. Thank goodness for mothers, we were thinking. But thanks, George, was what Mary said. George is Mary's spouse and Jake's father. George died in 2021 of cancer. George was also a farrier and a teamster and a draft horse legend, and he carried that great spirit of generosity we still see in Jake. We all miss George. As my fellow farmer said, I never thought I'd get to drive a horse that George trained. And I will say, you will not have seen Button in any of these slides because she was such a handful that we never got to take a picture of her. Whoops. Uh-oh. Batteries and everything have fallen out. But I'll keep going. Okay, Button gradually settled down on our farm, showing her solid training and remembering her good manners. But that didn't mean she wasn't a handful. George liked hot horses, and Button is hot. She's a hot Button. At our farm, we introduced Button to just one horse, Clyde, while the 3 recovering horses stayed at our neighbors. Luckily, Clyde is a very steady, very sleepy horse, so he made a good calming partner for the high-headed Button. Button was learning a lot, and so were we, such as how Button likes to run away when she sees a person coming with a halter. a person without a halter, Button is your best friend. Still, a horse-horse relationship always tops a horse-human relationship, and Clyde never minds being haltered. So we would halter Clyde as Button trotted around us in circles. Then we would walk away with Clyde. By the time we got to the gate, Button realized what was happening, and she would give up and stand for the halter. And Button loved Clyde, but she didn't love all the rest of the new things at the farm. A new stable, new harness, new scary farming noises. But she managed. She even muscled up. I think we've gotten her from cream puff to cream cheese, my fellow reported to our farrier and his mother. She's doing great. Button was doing great. And were we ever glad to have her visiting, hot or not? She was getting us through one long, hard garden season, thanks in no small part to George and to his human and horse legacy. So our last little section here is poems. And I'm just going to start by quoting 2 lines from a Wendell Berry poem. I really wanted to read the whole thing, but I'm going to end up being over time if I do. So it's called Ripening. So if you want to go home and look up Wendell Berry's wonderful poem called Ripening, and I picked it because of my theme, the first 2 lines are, and this is kind of dedicated to my sweetheart here, the first 2 lines are, the longer we are together, the larger death grows around us. And this next poem is about our horse Betsy, and you did see her in the slides. She was one of the black horses. She was quite alive in this poem. She's dead now, but she was very alive in this poem. Betsy. Betsy, sweat slick and salty, just off the harrow. Her black coat dries faster than I can work my brush. Sweat marks stand out white on shoulders and hindquarters, ghost traces of the harness on her yet. I reach up to scrub her neck. She leans hard into the brush, taking the push and pushing back with the pleasure of it. Groomed, she trots out to pasture, slows, lowers herself to ground. Then comes the vigorous, unrestrained roll. She grunts enormously, deeply, rolls and grunts. At last she rises, shakes off the dust and the work and the ghosts, trots off to graze. I linger, watching, to be so much body, to be so forthright. You were very generous with your clapping. Thank you. Now, my second poem is about a beloved CSA member. She loved our farm. She especially loved tomatoes. She always wanted to have a tomato parade for us. And the tomato parade we ended up having was at her memorial service on our farm. She died in 2022. And I wrote a poem then, but it was too sad even for me to read. So I'm going to read you a poem about the 2-year anniversary. It's called 2 Years In. In Memoriam, Susan Gadbois, 1966 to 2022. 2 years in, and all I can think of is you laughing. All I can think of is a field vast with snow, a wild, rollicking ocean. All I can think of is shaking with cold and a fire so hot I turn my back to it. I turn my face to it, turn my back to it, turn my face to it. I turn my face to you, blue and gone as the sky, which is to say, not gone, not gone, not gone. And here's my last poem. So this is kind of a long view of our short human and horse lives. And it's called Rock. And this is a prose poem. I never really got prose poems. Like, is it prose? Is it a poem? Why are we doing this? But then I wrote one, and it was really fun. So that's what I'm going to read to you tonight. And it's called Rock. Winding up the narrow lanes of New Hampshire mountains, I see a giant rock, thinking of crossing the road. I'm going to get inside that rock and think with it. Think about the glacier and how it brought us here. Think about the rain and snow and wind, and sometimes the sun warming us up. Think about how the woods grew taller and taller around us. How one day there was a lot of noise, and then the road was in our way. Think about how we might cross that road and find a quieter place. Or maybe we'll just wait for that road to disappear. Me and the rock, we're thinking about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Bob King.
Well, hello, everybody. Get this all set. Ooh, what happened? Oh, there we are. We're good, Martin. Okay, sorry about that. Good to see you all. So some of you know me as sort of a hydroelectric guy. I hope you didn't come here tonight to hear about that, because that's not why I'm here. Tonight, I'm here to talk to you about the adventures of my wife, Annie Faulkner, and me in venture conservation. So it kind of all started about 90 years ago when Annie's grandparents bought this camp in Stoddard, and it later became known, along with many surrounding acres of beautiful forest land, as the Andorra Forest. And of course, it is known for tremendous wildlife habitat. It's also known for blueberries, as our young son Ben demonstrates. Annie and I have always spent a lot of time there, and we actually got married there on top of Jackson Hill in the middle of Andorra, although we were living in Boston at the time. This was the mid-90s. Well, we were both pretty busy in Boston doing our jobs. We didn't take a honeymoon for 2 years after our wedding, but when we finally took it, we took it with interest. We took a 2-month honeymoon to southern Chile, where we spent a lot of time hitchhiking around and getting very wet, hitchhiking through the rainforest in open pickup trucks, and trekking through amazing mountains and glaciers and rivers, and camping amongst beautiful ancient forests. But perhaps most importantly for our long-term trajectory, we ended up meeting these incredible people, Doug and Chris Tompkins. And they had just left busy sort of business life in the United States, and she had been the CEO of Patagonia, and he was the founder of North Face and Esprit, and they had left all that behind to move to Chile to undertake giant conservation projects. And their whole raison d'etre was all about biodiversity and conservation. And Annie and I were just so thrilled to meet them. Later, I would go back many times, well, we both would, to help them with clean energy projects on their lands. But their sort of grand vision really inspired Annie and me to go home and try to do something, I mean, not at their scale. By the way, Doug sadly died about 10 years ago, but by the time Chris was done doing her work, she had been directly responsible for the protection in new national parks of 15 million acres. So these people really knew how to get it done. So we went home to New Hampshire, well, to Boston, but then we said, we've got to move to New Hampshire, closer to Andorra Forest, and see what we can do to sort of, advocate and practice landscape scale conservation. And so we found a place for sale. It abutted Andorra to the south. It's the old Pearly Sweat place. Some of you may have heard about the legendary Pearly Sweat. That's Taylor Pond in the distance. And so we moved there. It was kind of a junkyard when we got there. We had to do some cleanup. But the other thing we quickly realized was that there was another big parcel of land for sale just south of the Pearly Sweat place, which was substantial itself. And so we started poking around that parcel, and we met some people at the Sweetwater Trust and at the Nature Conservancy. And it turns out my mother from church knew the guy that owned the next parcel. And by the time we were all done, the Nature Conservancy got donated from us an easement on our property. They bought the big intermediate property, and they were donated the other property that my mother knew the owner of. So it turned into this great big project. Today it's known as the Otterbrook Conservation Area, if any of you know it. And one thing about it's kind of interesting, it's mostly forever wild. So except for about 30 acres on our property, it's all forever wild, which means it'll be not cut ever, and no agriculture practice except in a little area around our house. So it's really going to be a deep wild forest, 100 years from now. Meantime, we had sort of caught wind of an industrial logger from Maine who was working a property to the west of Andorra, and we sort of started poking around that one and found out that there was a 50-lot subdivision planned for it. So we said, whoa, we can't let that happen. And we were able to work sort of through a straw buyer to pick up that parcel. We did an easement with the Forest Society, about 20% of which was forever wild, the rest being a forestry easement. And then we resold it at a small profit. So this is where we come up with the term venture conservation. We sort of try to keep the finances such that you can keep the conservation project going. Anyhow, living at the Pearly Sweat place, well, here's Pearly. Some of you have probably read the amazing book written by his granddaughter, Sheila. This photo taken by Ernie Hebert in 1968. And Pearly, of course, was a legend. He was known as the Hermit of Taylor Pond. He was a great poet. And later, if I have time, I'll share a little bit of one of his poems with you. He shared a common boundary with Annie's grandparents at the Andorra Forest. And at some point, they all needed to sort of tweak that boundary to, straighten it out and make it more logical. And they were able to do that, Annie's grandparents and Pearly, without ever hiring a lawyer. And they were so thrilled about this, Pearly in particular, that, he wrote the Faulkners a letter sort of just expressing his gratitude for all this. And for Annie and her two sisters, he started 3 little bank accounts at the Savings Bank of Keene, each spiked with $50, as his way of showing his gratitude to the family. And this, therefore, is like Annie was 6 or 7 at the time. She had visited Pearly, feeding his goats and whatnot. And, Pearly really liked Annie and her sisters. And it was kind of the first time that Annie or I had charmed a lovable curmudgeon in our pursuit of conservation, although we didn't realize the conservation would come until, 30 years later. But we'll get back to Pearly a little bit. So another thing about the Pearly Sweat place, it was just a wonderful place to raise our kids. And, so they learned how to stack firewood at a young age. They learned about sugaring. They learned about interacting with nature. And Annie and I also learned quite a bit. We sort of started to study conservation biology. We became familiar with the importance of core protected areas and connectivity between protected areas and carnivores at the sort of the top of the trophic pyramid. And, we had this wild fantasy about big carnivores returning to southwest New Hampshire. That may or may not ever happen. But in order to welcome big cats, we had this painting painted on the side of our tractor shed of the Maxie cat. We call it Maxine. So at some point, our kids were old enough and sort of interested in extracurriculars, and we decided it was time to move to Keene. We weren't going to stop conserving, so we quickly learned, well, first we started meeting folks at the Monadnock Conservancy. We met Ann McBride, for example. I'm sure you're here somewhere, Ann. And she turned us on to a parcel that was for sale down here right near Pisgah, which we were able to buy. Over here is Horatio Colony, by the way, just so you can get oriented. So Keene, Pisgah. Again, it's all about connectivity. And we also worked with the Conservancy on the little John Summers parcel here to connect directly to Pisgah for trails and so forth. But the big kahuna was over here. It was a big parcel under one ownership on West Hill. And Dick Ober, who was the director of the Conservancy at the time, had talked with us about it. And the great ecologist Rick Vandepaul knew all about it. And both of them told me, oh, Bob, the guy who owns that, you'll never be able to deal with him. He's kind of this crazy old curmudgeon. And another friend of ours was a realtor in town and said, Bob, you have to keep an eye on the Keene Sentinel, because every so often, like once a year, there'll be an ad to sell all this land on West Hill. And I thought, that's funny, but lo and behold, like 3 months later, I opened the Keene Sentinel in the back, and there's an ad, of all this land for sale on West Hill. So I said, yeah, let's go for it. And so I called the guy. His name was Arthur Place, and he was kind of gruff sounding, as I said, potentially another curmudgeon. But he said, oh, I'll show you the land. And we go out, we meet at the base of this long road up the hill, and he's in a big old GMC 3/4-ton pickup. The craziest thing about this pickup is that, most pickup trucks, you steer the steering wheel, the front wheels pitch back and forth, and you turn. Well, the rear wheels turned also, so that he could turn this big truck on a dime. I had never seen anything like this. And I'm an engineer, and I became quite excited about it. And he really appreciated that. So we were already sort of bonding over his crazy pickup truck. Then we go up there, we're touring around, he's showing me sites, oh, that's where the bear, was up the hemlock, and that's where I saw moose and so forth. It's really fun. And then he wanted to show me his potential cabin site. And we're driving along in his big truck, and we're into some pretty narrow roads, and it's kind of muddy, it's April, it's stony, and next thing you know, we're stuck. Zzz, the wheels are spinning, he locks the differential, still can't get unstuck. And so I get out, and he's an older gentleman. He wasn't about to jump out and, solve the problem. So I get out, I see there's a bottle jack in the back of the truck, there's some scraps of lumber. It took about a half an hour, but I was able to jack up the truck, get some lumber and rocks under it, and get him freed up, and off we went. And he was so pleased that, by the end of our little excursion, he said, Bob, you've got to own this land. So, of course, I was thinking, venture conservation, I got to talk down the price. That didn't happen, but we did end up with the land. So that was great, and we worked with the Conservancy. And, again, to keep this sort of venture conservation thing going, we actually sold the easement to the Conservancy to replenish our coffers a little bit. And we included about 20% of the land as forever wild, most of it forestry easement. Great project, wonderful to work with the Conservancy. Just a few quick, whoops, that was the laser. Again, only 3 miles from downtown Keene, but you're up on this hill, and it's very remote and wild. Great big beaver meadows. We did Arthur Place had heavily cut it, so we were doing timber stand improvement, which helps bring back a more diverse forest more quickly. And in doing so, we generated a lot of red oak firewood, and we had our kids up there processing firewood for quite some time. Our little splitting camp did about 10 cords, I think. Let's see, where does that take us? that takes us to, oh, goodness sakes. So I think this was 2023 in the fall. A couple things were trending. I was preparing to sell half of my fleet of hydroelectric power plants, and this meant I was going to have some free cash. And the other thing that happened is my crazy brother-in-law, Bob Munger here, called me. He was a software guy, retired. Called me and said, Bob, I'm hiking the entire Appalachian Trail at age 72 or something. You got to come join me. And so I said, okay, I'll join you in the Mahoosics of northern New Hampshire, where I've always heard is incredibly beautiful, but I've never been. So how many people here have been to the Mahoosics? Good. So you guys know how pretty it is. It's much lesser well-known than the presidentials or even the Whites proper. So anyhow, I met Bob up in Maine, and we hiked south through the Mahoosics, mostly on a ridge with incredible views. And looking down to the southwest, I noticed this really lovely valley with smaller hills in it and great views. And I said, whoa, what's that all about? And so when I got home later, looking at the conservation maps, I realized, it's not showing up in any color. It's not conserved. And I thought, whoa, what's up with that? And more research revealed it was owned by the Yale Endowment, which owns 750,000 acres in the North Country. And it's managed by Wagner Timber out of Lyme, which is a bunch of really interesting, good people. So I just, my little wheels started turning. What can we do about that? Meanwhile, you notice there's a little dagger sort of poking into the lower of the two big orange parcels, which are the Yale lands. But the dagger was owned by somebody else. And I thought, well, I can't end up owning this big stuff and have this little dagger sort of bisecting the lower piece. So, of course, I had to find out who owned that. Go to the Shelburne Town Hall. This is Shelburne, New Hampshire, a great little town. And they tell me, oh, that's, this guy, Howard Tucker, owns that. Well, who's that and where does he live? Well, we don't know, and he hasn't paid taxes in 3 years. And, so I spent a lot of time chasing that guy down. But let me just share with you a little more about the land, which we did end up buying from Yale, and we call it Falling Waters Forest. Why is it Falling Waters? One reason is that the money to buy it came from hydropower, from my hydro plants. The other reason is that it's full of waterfalls. It's just, there's water everywhere. It's just incredible. This is a 300-foot cascade called the Dryad Fall, which I'm told is the tallest in the state. But it's not in the books because it runs dry part of the year, which is great, because that means otherwise I think we'd have people crawling all over the place. Just lovely views everywhere. It's heavily forested, but also Wagner cut pretty heavily, about 2/3 of it. Alpine wetlands. Okay, so there was a certain day when I was really struggling with whether I wanted to spend a lot of money on this land. Again, it was all for conservation. It was a good project, but I'm a frugal Yankee, and I was really struggling. Do I do this or not? And then a local friend up there sent me this photo. Remember, Annie and I, we're really interested in predators. Well, he sent me this photo. The foot here is the foot of a Fish and Game officer who took this photo and said, this is a wolf track. So I said, yeah, that's the land for us. That put me over the top. And in fact, they did find wolf tracks all over the place. A lone wolf. It's not like we have a pack of wolves, which would be amazing, but a lone wolf passed through. The place is full of big trees. Again, most of it was cut, but they were very respectful of the stream corridors. So we go to the streams, which are everywhere, and we find all these amazing trees like this white pine and these beautiful hemlocks and this high elevation spruce fir forest, very little of which they cut, so there's a lot of that left. Just fantastic. And then this big guy. This is our latest find. This is a northern white cedar. And you can sort of see from the morphology of this tree, it's almost like a sequoia, like the branch is like its own tree. I mean, I did some initial research, and I figure this tree was 150 years old when the Minutemen were shooting at the Redcoats at the Old North Bridge. So this tree can tell some stories. Okay, here's the view from sort of a central ridge in this in these parcels, and this was the land that dagger I showed you represents. So this was not part of the bigger deal, and I just knew I had to get my hands on this. And so I finally went about tracking down the address of this guy, Howard Tucker, right? And I go to his house in Bridgeton, Maine, because I'd actually sent him a letter and didn't hear. In fact, the letter was returned, cannot deliver. So I go to his house. It's a Sunday. I find the address. The house is burned to the ground. I talk to the neighbor who's working in his driveway, and the neighbor says, "Oh, you don't want to deal with that guy. He's a druggie. He's a crazy guy. You don't want anything to do with him." So then I go to the local police station. It's a Sunday, so there's nobody around, but there was the phone you can pick up outside and call for an officer. And I did this. Officer comes up. "Officer, I'm looking for Howard Tucker." He says, "Whoa, what do you want with him?" And he says, "You don't want to deal with that guy. He's dangerous. And the people he hangs out with, you don't want to mess with that guy." So then I'm starting to freak out, and I'm thinking, well, I need that land, but I obviously can't meet this guy because he's dangerous. So I hire an attorney. Oh, the officer told me he thought Howard Tucker had moved to Westbrook, Maine. So I hire an attorney in Westbrook who incidentally has a black belt. That's why I chose him. And I say, "You go find Howard Tucker and, deliver my offer," or something like that. And this guy spent 6 months, never could find him. Had like 3 or 4 different addresses, homes foreclosed upon, all this crazy stuff. Pretty much gave up. So then I hired a private investigator. And he thought he had an address for me. And this was in Casco, Maine. And I drove by that house at one point in Casco, Maine. I had a friend with me. And I went and knocked on the door, and I heard like low, subdued voices and scurrying of feet. But nobody came to the door. And I knocked again, and same thing. And at that point I thought, I better get out of here. This is not good. So I left. So then the private investigator sends his little cousin Joey to stake out the joint. And they report that they did see people, like the place is inhabited. And so finally, a decision was made between the private investigator and myself. Let's just leave a letter on the doorstep. And that's what we did. And, I wrote the letter, gave it to the PI, and he left the thing. And I was kind of sure that wasn't going to go anywhere. And then like 2 weeks later, I get a call, 207 area code. "Oh, hi, it's Howard Tucker. I hear you want to buy my land." And he said he wanted to meet me and take me to the land and show me around. And I'm thinking, he's going to kill me. I don't want to go there. And yet it became clear that, I said, "Mr. Tucker, why don't I just send you an offer in the mail or something?" And he said, No, you've got to see the land. And so finally we said, okay. And we made a plan to meet at Shelburne Town Hall. And Annie and I drove up there, and we waited, and he was not really there on time. And then finally this little dilapidated pickup truck shows up, and this funny little guy hops out, says, "Hi, I'm Howard, call me Jay." And he's got very few teeth left, and he's a little disheveled, but he was very sweet. And he said, "Hop in, and the truck, I'll take you there." And I'm thinking, oh no, he's going to knife me, and Annie better follow closely to pick up the pieces. But we get to the trailhead. There's a nice system of trails up there on the property, and I'm still pretty nervous about the whole thing. But we get on the trail. The other thing I was thinking, he's going to die. He's not a hiker, he's a drug lord, right? But we get on the trail, and he's just sprinting along, and he's really fit. And then he stops, and he starts looking at tracks, and he says, "Look, it's a ruffed grouse. And look at the bobcat tracks chasing a snowshoe hare." Like, he knows everything. He's a naturalist. And he's telling me about ecosystem disturbance and all these things. And I'm thinking, God, this is unbelievable. As the hike went on, he was taking me to the high ridge up here. It turns out, he had worked at hydroelectric plants as a welder, and of course that's what I do, and so we bonded over that. He takes turmeric for his arthritis, so do I. We bonded over that. By the time it was over, we were like blood brothers. It was just, and he was so fit, and I said, "Howard, Jay, you're so fit." And he says, "Yeah, well, I'm a semi-pro boxer." So, anyhow, meet Howard Tucker. Notice the Looney Tunes shirt. the dangerous drug lord wearing a Looney Tunes shirt. And look at his arm. This guy's beefy. Anyhow, and over there you see the purchase and sale agreement signed in duplicate. On the way down the trail, we struck a deal. It was just like 9 months it took to find the guy, and one afternoon, one little hike, and we had a deal. So, and then at the closing, which was a few weeks later in Conway, it was really nice to see him again, actually, at the closing. And I noticed, like, partway through, he was tearing up. And I said, Jay, what's up? And he said, well, I'm just really sad to, say goodbye to the land. But Bob, I'm just so glad that, people like you are going to take care of it. And it means so much to me. And, it's just really a sort of a beautiful moment as I can't even call him a curmudgeon, but in the theme of my story of dealing with curmudgeons, we could, I guess. But really a wonderful man. I was so touched by him that I made a donation to the Portland Boxing Club, where he's a trainer. He's a trainer. He's trained some really high-level boxers. Anyhow, I just want to wrap up by sharing a little bit. Kim, it was so great to hear some poetry, and I love Wendell Berry, so that was really sweet. So this is a book about Pearly Sweat that I referenced earlier. Some of you have probably read it. So Pearly lived alone at the end of this long, long gravel road at this place that Annie and I now own, although we're renting it out right now since we live in Keene. And Pearly became quite lonely, and he was married, but then I can't remember. Did he maybe emotionally abused his wife or something? Something went haywire, and she left him. So at some point, he wrote a poem called Housekeeper Wanted. And it was very intentional, this poem, and the idea was to, solicit a new partner to live with him at the end of the road. And he printed 500 copies and distributed them all over the place, hoping to find a woman. And it also ran in Yankee magazine. Where's Jamie? Yeah, so you probably know about this, Jamie Trowbridge. Yeah, it ran in Yankee magazine. I'm just going to read you the last couple stanzas. And when it says earthly angels, that's a reference to, this woman or these legions of women that are going to come and want to live with him. But these earthly angels are not very easily discovered. Though many might be living between Oregon and Maine, yet unless the abode of one may be soon uncovered, perhaps this old farmhouse may never have a housekeeper again. So I just want Pearly to know, and Pearly's buried there on the property right near the house. I just want Pearly to know that not only does the house have a housekeeper or keepers in the form of Annie and me, because we do take great care of the place, but if we sort of zoom out and broaden our idea of house and home to the ancient Greek for a home, which is ekos, as in ecology and ecosystems, I would like to think that Annie and I are also trying to be housekeepers, for the greater ecosystem around all these places that we've worked on, and that the Monadnock Conservancy works on, of course, because in the end, it's not really about us humans, at least in our outlook. It's equally about, our furred and finned and feathered friends, our four-legged kin who live with their families in the forests and fields around us. So that's really what motivates Annie and me, and I know it's what often motivates the Monadnock Conservancy. And, if there's anybody in this crowd that has 5 or 50 or 500 acres and is thinking about conserving it, please do so. Maybe with the Conservancy, maybe with the Forest Society or TNC, but get on it, get it done. All right, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your next speaker, Milton Trimitsis, and with this very, very special guest, Cass.
I've never held one of these before. This is very scary. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Oh, yeah. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Milton Trimitsis. Better? Ooh, yeah. I'm Milton Trimitsis. I'm from 5 Sigma Farm in Sullivan. This is Cass, my semi-retired lead dog. So I moved to Sullivan about 10 years ago to raise sheep. I didn't really know anything about the area at that point. I had been in Boston for 26 years before then. And once I moved up, she does, yes. You want to take her? Once I moved up, people were often asking me, well, what's it like? What's your impression of making this huge change in your life? And the overwhelming sense I had was of all the things I didn't know and all the things I needed to learn. And early on, I had lived and trained dogs for many years, but early on, one of the things I realized was that when dogs live on a farm, they have this autonomy and independence that they don't get as city dogs, and they start exhibiting behaviors that you would never see in a different setting. So Cass one day was with me. We were out in a field. I had a group of rams out in a field, and I was going to move them from one fenced area to another. And the cardinal rule of rams is that you never turn your back to them, and you really, really never turn your back and bend over. And of course, I got distracted, and I violated all of those rules. And as I was fussing with the fence, I felt this little tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and I had this big black Katahdin ram at that point, and he was almost on top of me. But what I had felt was Cass brushing my shoulder as she went by. She had been on the other side of the field. She saw this ram coming at me, and she came in and intercepted him midair and drove him across the field and said, not today. So that was a really important lesson for me to realize that, wow, these creatures they can express things once we give them some space that they wouldn't otherwise, that I had never seen them express before. Another thing that I didn't know much about when I first moved to Sullivan was anything about the area. I had been living in Boston. I ran a woodworking company. I knew for many years that I wanted a farm. I drew a 2-hour driving circle around Boston, and I started looking for a farm. And after 10 years, I found one that looked like it would work, that looked like I could afford, and never really had a chance to ask anything about what's this place I'm moving to. So I get here, and I realize that there is this profound sense of nostalgia and goodwill for sheep in the area that I never expected. And it's been a tremendous boon for me. One of the ways that expressed itself is very early on. I had a modest flock of sheep and a little bit of land that wasn't very fertile, and I was grazing, and pretty quickly I was running out of grazing, and I was looking for grass, and people just spontaneously started calling me and saying, hey, I got this land over here. Would you like to bring your sheep to it? Would you like to start grazing it? And pretty soon I had a bunch of little parcels around the area, around Sullivan, and they were available to me to start grazing. Is my dog bothering anybody? You got her? Okay. You can bring her back if you want, or not. And at the beginning, I had Cass. I had a couple other herding dogs. I wasn't a very good shepherd. I trained my dogs a little bit. They weren't all that good at herding sheep either. So I had to get sheep from here to there. And you know, I did it the way people do it. You get a truck, you get a trailer, you load the sheep on the trailer, you move them to another field, you graze the field, you load the sheep up again, you move them on. And as my flock got bigger, this turned into a pretty big production. I mean, it would sometimes take 4 trailer loads to get my sheep from one field to another, and that could end up being 10 or 12 hours. And it was incredibly stressful for me. I think it was stressful for the sheep because the flock got separated, often ewes from lambs got separated. I think the dogs enjoyed it, but it was exhausting for them. They would be dead by the end of the day. So then another thing I learned, I was doing that thing that people do on the internet and looking at YouTube videos, and I learned that, oh my goodness, sheep have legs. And they can walk places. And this hadn't really occurred to me, and as soon as I started realizing that people do this, it was very exciting, because I thought, oh my God, I might, you know, not moving sheep by trailer would be awesome. But it also filled me with terror. You know, the 2 specific forms of the terror were that the sheep would get away from me. I'd be moving up the road, the sheep would get away from me, and they'd end up in New Jersey. And I'd have a lot of explaining to do. And that also we'd be moving the sheep, and I would inspire road rage. That there would be all these people in cars, and they'd say, what are these damn sheep doing in the road? And so to allay my first fear, I started calling up all of the more experienced shepherds and their dogs that I knew about. And at that point, I learned that people really, really like to come places and do work with their dogs. That I had essentially a waiting list of people who wanted to come help me move the sheep. And at first, because I was so scared of the whole premise, I would have 3 or 4 other people with their dogs and a couple of my dogs, and we'd be moving up the road, and the sheep didn't really have any opportunity at all to misbehave. And then, you know, we did it. We did it the first time. It went okay. And the shock, maybe the most shocking part of it to me, was that people in cars on the road weren't angry at us. They were stopping, they were parking by the side, and they had their phones out. They had these huge smiles on their faces. And that's, again, where I started to understand this deep well of goodwill for people raising animals. And it seemed like it was something that people either remembered directly or had almost an ancestral memory of, and seeing it again kind of made them feel about their town in a way that they wanted to feel. People sometimes even bring out lawn chairs. It's really remarkable. It also gave me the opportunity to learn that, Cass? That the dogs really are able to express their independence and their creativity and their initiative in settings like that. So I don't know if you spent a lot of time with sheep. They have a reputation for being a little dull and a little bit passive. It's not very true. Sheep are sneaky and devious and always plotting. And a lot of it's about food, but some of it's about other things. But so we'll be moving down the road, and the sheep will see a field that they like and think, ooh, we should stop there. And often, by the time I would realize that was happening, it was all over. The sheep were off in the field, and sheep are also stubborn, so once they've committed to something, it's very hard to convince them out of it. But I learned that the good dogs are watching and understand the job, understand what we're trying to accomplish, and see that one sheep up there in front is thinking about going off into that field And without my saying anything, one of my dogs will pop over and give the sheep a little talking to and say, "Excuse me, sir, but we're not doing that right now." And the sheep would tuck back in, and it would be almost as if nothing had happened. So it was a delightful thing to watch. Another thing I learned is that sheep have religion. And it turns out that their deity is a miniature horse named Drizzle. So we were moving sheep down Center Street in Sullivan one day, and I have a neighbor who has a small rescue farm, and she's a little bit forgetful. And I had told her 3 times that we were going to be walking a couple hundred sheep past her farm, including about an hour before we did it. And it slipped her mind. So as we got there, all of her animals were out and loose. And this little miniature horse named Drizzle comes trotting out to see what's going on and sort of approaches the sheep. And the sheep all turn, look at Drizzle, bow a little bit, and follow Drizzle off into the hinterlands. And Drizzle was not comfortable with her role as a deity, so she was terrified and took off running. So the sheep took off running after her. And it ended up taking us longer than I'd like to convince first Drizzle to go back home and then to convince the sheep to turn around, because in the meantime they'd found some nice grass, because God leads you to good food. So again, I learned that if you trust the dogs and trust the sheep, eventually they'll do what you ask them to do. And over time, we, being my dogs and I, have gotten a little more of a clue and gotten a little more confident. And for a couple of years now, I don't need to impose on my shepherd friends anymore to do these road moves. And it's usually me and a couple of dogs, and then I'm able to draw on this wonderful well of willing neighbors who help out, some in the front, some in the back, to tell cars, "Hey, there's a bunch of sheep coming, you might want to slow down." And that's turned into a sort of beautiful community gathering. Sometimes it's just 3 of us, somebody in front, somebody behind, me, 2 dogs. Sometimes people tell me, "Oh, my family's coming to town. Can they join?" And we'll end up with 8 or 10 people on these walks. And it has ended up being a really nice event. And further confirming this idea that the town has really welcomed the presence of the animals. A couple of years ago, a neighbor of mine in the next town over in Nelson said, "Hey, do you want to come graze our fields?" And I thought, how the hell am I going to get across Route 9? And I learned that the same well of goodwill and nostalgia exists in the sheriff's department. And I talked to one person, then another person, and they said, "Oh, you should talk to Lieutenant Carroll." And I talked to Lieutenant Carroll, or no, it was Lieutenant Melvin first. And he said, "Yeah, my sister used to be a sheepdog handler, and I always meant to go see her train her sheep and run her sheep in trials. And I never got around to it, and then she died." And he just had this look of joy whenever he was standing there in the middle of Route 9 holding traffic for us to get across. And he retired last year. When I tried to reach him, I was told he'd retired. I thought, oh, we're screwed. We're never going to find another police officer who wants to get us across. And it turned out there was a line of people in the sheriff's department who were dying to have that as a Thursday morning gig. So I guess the sum of it all for me has been that I learned also that I'll never be a local. I think you have to have grandchildren born here before you get to be a local, but it does feel a little bit like I've started to become part of the fabric of the community, and it's something I'm really grateful for.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our last speaker for the evening, Jamie Trowbridge.
Good evening, but first, a big hand for Ben Cosgrove. Delightful. I want to start by thanking the Monadnock Conservancy for all the good work it's doing, and I want to wish you all a happy end of March. You know, March, I know most people hate March. It's the end of winter, and everybody's sick of it. In fact, this March, the weather has been a little depressing, I admit. So much so that I've been remembering my first boss's advice, which was never make any important decisions in March. I've always defended March as one of the best months in the year here in New England, but I have a tough time with it. It's, you know, I think that March is the warmest month of winter, it's the lightest month of winter, and I think that the combination of white snow and a bluebird sky and a warm March sun is one of the great combinations in nature, right up there with the ocean meeting the shore. Maybe some non-March haters in the group. I thought most of you would agree with Garrison Keillor, who said that God invented March so that people who don't drink know what a hangover feels like. But we'll leave that where it is. I'm really pleased to be able to speak here tonight. I did speak at one of these events previously. Maybe it's possible the very first one. I was heard that this is the 12th year they've been doing it. It's a really wonderful occasion, and I want to thank the Monadnock Conservancy for putting this on. The last time I spoke, I told a story about growing up in Dublin with Elliot and Kathleen Allison, who led nature walks in Dublin for elementary school kids, and there's some of them here, for 30 years. And that story was well received, so I'm going to tell another story about growing up in Dublin And my apologies to those of you who might have heard this one before. So you all live around here, you live in small towns, and you know that when something goes wrong, they call the fire department. Obviously, for a fire, they call the fire department, a car accident, but actually, if anything goes wrong, they call the fire department. And when I was growing up in Dublin, all the volunteer firemen had radios in their cars and radios in their homes, and it was amazing how fast they could get to you if someone called the fire department about you. So, first time they called the fire department about me, I was 6. Warren Whitney and I were walking down Route 101 from school, walking home on the sidewalk, unattended. They would never let kids do that now. And there was this little mill pond that's not there anymore because the dam broke, but there was this little mill pond that had frozen over and there was an inch of snow on it. And we were walking across the pond and someone driving by must have been alarmed to see our footprints filling up with water. And so we were a good bit down the road, back on the sidewalk, most of the way home, when up drives Chief Worcester, head of the fire department. And Chief Worcester is this imposing figure. He's got this broad shoulders, got a flat top haircut, and I don't really remember him saying anything. All I remember is we are suddenly back up the hill in the principal's office. She has called our moms, and we're getting reamed out for walking across the thin ice, and I cannot process it. I'm supposed to be this good kid, and here I am in trouble. The next time they called the fire department about me was 2 years later and we were over at Warren Whitney's house after school, unattended again. I think that maybe his older sisters were supposed to be watching us, but they were a good bit older, and they had told us they were going out for a cross-country ski. And we were like, yeah, we should go out for a cross-country ski. And this is back when you have those rubber boots and the cable bindings for your downhill skis. So all you have to do is unclip that cable at the back, and bingo, you got some cross-country skis. So out we go, and we're out in the woods following the tracks that his sisters made, and we didn't think we were lost, but it sure was dark when they drove up behind us in 2 snowmobiles. And we're standing there in the glare of the snowmobile lights, and who steps off the front snowmobile? It's Chief Worcester. All right, now it's probably another year or 2 later, and I'm over at Ian and Nikki Silich's house. And moved to the other side of town, over by the Wrights. They're all there, the Wright Mafia right there. And we're at Ian and Nikki Silich's house, unattended. Their mom worked, she wasn't home. And we get the bright idea that what we really should be doing is lighting napkins on fire. So we decided to go outside, at least we did that. But it turns out it might have been better if we lit those napkins in the kitchen because it's a dry fall day and the wind's blowing. And we set up shop about 10 feet from the house in a stand of dry leaves on the windward side of the house. That's the best place to do this. And Ian lights the first napkin, burns his fingers, drops the napkin, leaves catch on fire, just like that. Boom, boom, boom. All right, brief moment of panic. What do you do to put out a fire? You need water. So we go running into the kitchen, open the door, into the kitchen, grab teacups out of the strainer because they're small and they'll fill up quickly. Run outside, spill most of it, put the water on the fire. It's not working. Fire is getting bigger. Now we're really panicking. And just then, a car stops on the road because their house is near the road, but it's down low. It's just like this. So they can't see what's happening down here, but they can see us. And the guy yells out the window, "Hey, what are you kids doing up there?" But Ian's got it under control. "Oh, nothing. It's no problem." no problem, no big deal. Amazingly, the man drives away. But he must not have thought that we had things under control, because a few minutes later, we hear the siren. And now, here it comes, not just Chief Worcester, but Chief Worcester, all our dads, the whole fire department, fire truck, the whole business, here it comes. And they come and put out the fire. Who knew you could stamp out a fire? They just came up, stamped it out. We're like, damn! But then they hosed it down because they brought the truck all this distance, and we're standing there in the smoke, and Chief Worcester looks at me and says, "How did that fire start?" And I cannot bring myself to answer his question. I stare at my shoes. I cannot bring myself to look him in the eye. And neither can I look him in the eye ever again. Chief Worcester is all over town. He is a man about town. He is from an old Dublin family. He runs the Worcester's Garage, which is the garage in town, now run by Alex Vogel right here. And before that, his dad ran it. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of the automobile age. And his mom is the librarian in town, Dorothy Worcester. She ends up working as the librarian in Dublin for 67 years. So, you can imagine, the shame I feel in front of them. And them being an old Dublin family, of course, my parents invited Mike Worcester to my wedding, along with everyone else in town. And I couldn't look at him in the receiving line. When I was about 60, When I was about 28, I moved back to Dublin with my family, and I would see Mike Worcester at the car store, which was his hangout. He'd have the coffee there every morning. And he would walk by me in the parking lot as if I wasn't there. And then the worst part, when I was 35, I had to call the fire department on myself. I had a chimney fire. You could just hear the roar, and if you ever had a chimney fire, the roar in this chimney. And I can tell you I waited a long time before I picked up that phone to make that call. In fact, if my wife and children weren't in that house, I might not have called at all. I might have just let it burn. But then in 2013, I went to Andy Elder's funeral, and Mike Worcester spoke at that funeral, right in the Dublin church in the middle of town. And Andy Elder, the Elders were another old Dublin family. There were 3 Elder families when we were growing up in Dublin. One of them was the postmaster, the man. Andy was an antiques dealer, and he lived just right in the village, 2 houses down from the church, so right near where Mike worked, and they were friends. And, I suppose, okay, it makes sense that you would invite Mike Worcester, if he's your friend, to speak at the funeral, but what would Mike say? The memorial service was terrific. Andy's 4 kids spoke first. His son, Bruce, sat just like sort of on the edge of the steps to the altar and just free-form reminisced about what it was like to grow up in the village, what it was like to return to the village. His 3 daughters had each composed really wonderful tributes to Andy, funny, warm, really great. And then it was Mike's turn to speak. And as he leaned into the microphone, I sort of held my breath, and I looked around. Everybody else was holding their breath. I may never have had a conversation with Mike, but all these people had, and they knew that asking Mike to back cleanup at a memorial service was taking a risk. But Mike landed it. He spoke with warmth about his friend. He brought Andy back to life for all of us, because Andy had had dementia for years. And the thing that sort of blew my mind, Mike was funny. And I think hearing Mike speak and make people laugh shook something loose in me. And so I went up to him at the reception, voluntarily, and I complimented him on his remarks. And we had a conversation. Mike spoke to me. Mike smiled at me. We didn't get into it because this is New England. But that day, that last chunk of shame that I'd been holding all those years for my misbehavior as a kid melted away. And, who knows? Maybe Mike Worcester never judged me that harshly after all. Maybe he just saw me for what I was, a free-range kid growing up in the woods in New Hampshire. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our brilliant speakers. That was amazing. Another round of applause for them. And to Ben Cosgrove for the beautiful music. Thanks to CC&D's for the delicious spread and the Peterborough Townhouse for hosting us tonight. And a special thank you to the team of staff who make this event possible every year. We really appreciate the effort you put forward to bring us all together for this special evening. And as you walk out, last call for the silent auction. A special thank you to the artists Jeannie Theme, Alicia Dracotis, Mary Islin, and Deborah Stevens, who contributed their time and talents for all to enjoy on the trail down in Jaffrey for this past month during the Heart Hike, and for a few lucky bidders to take home tonight. So the stories we heard tonight, really a true celebration of this place and our community. Each of us has our own story to tell, how our connection to the land has shaped us, shaped our lives, and impacted us in profound ways. We each also have a powerful role to play in caring for this place. We are the current stewards of the shared beauty and bounty of the Monadnock region. And in the coming year, we really invite you to deepen your connection to the Conservancy and make an investment in conservation. It is your support, your generosity, that ensures land is conserved and stewarded so future generations will be able to share in our love for the land. Thank you so much. We look forward to continuing our work together.